Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent, the Lumina Foundation podcast about learning after high school. I'm your host, Dakota Palicki, and I'm very excited to share with you today our annual Looking Back, Looking Ahead show. Each year, we take a moment to review the year's major and sometimes a little peculiar higher education news stories and themes, and do our best to predict what's to come in the new year. As we get started today, I want to note that we recorded most of this show in mid to late December. You'll hear us talking about the pandemic, boosters, and vaccinations, and with Omicron and other pandemic-related issues moving quickly, some of what you hear from our guests may have changed over the few weeks of winter break. To help us look back and ahead, we've solicited the help of NPR correspondent for higher education, Elissa Nadworny, and the help of our friend and co-host, Dr. Katherine Wheatle. But first, I'm delighted to welcome back the ever-insightful Danielle Douglas-Gabriel, who covers higher education for the Washington Post. Danielle, it is so great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I know. We last did this in January, and I know that's like a year ago, but it feels like I just saw you, and yet here we're back looking again at what we got wrong in this new year, what came out of it, and what we can expect moving forward.
Yeah, I think those are good things, right?
Those are very good things. I got to imagine that you kept pretty busy this past year with everything that you've been covering.
Definitely. I think a lot of what I was covering is will it or won't it happen? And that covered kind of the broad-based student loan repayment or some of the Biden administration's agenda, when these things were going to happen, even student debt cancellation, which, we are, a month and almost 2 months away from repayment starting back. And there's no real clarity on what will happen on that broad-based cancellation promise. So it's a lot of will it happen? Won't it happen? And that's been, it's been 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm going to retitle our show, Will It or Will It Happen? Will it or will it not happen? I think that's a great title for this episode. Let's dig in. I mean, you just started talking about it. January 31st, 2022 is when repayments are supposed to kick back on for those who have some student loans, federal student loans. I know that you've been kind of keeping an eye on the equitable restart of this and all those conversations. What have you been covering over the past year around that?
I think a big component of this is what it'll look like, right? So we've gone almost 2 years without folks having to make payments. Many folks, not everyone, because it wasn't as broad-based as I think some advocates would have liked, but the vast majority of federal loan borrowers haven't had to make payments on their loans for almost 2 years. Now, the interesting piece is that there are about 8 million people who were in default on their federal loans before the pandemic. Now, because of the way the pandemic pause worked, they technically satisfy a requirement that would allow them to rehabilitate their loans and get out of default. But the department has said they're in discussions about this, but they haven't committed to whether or not they're going to put these people back into repayment in a way that erases their default. Senator Warren and a number of Senate Democrats have been urging the department to give these folks a clean slate, let them go back into repayment in a way that doesn't mar their credit, that doesn't affect their ability to collect their tax returns and all of that. And that's kind of what we'd be facing if the Secretary of Education does not act on this before the repayment pause ends, which is at the end of January.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. And I guess I can't help but wonder, in addition to, letting those who were in default move in to rehabilitation, if there's at least other considerations for rethinking student loans generally. I mean, we saw during the pandemic, a lot of institutions use recovery dollars to wipe out balances owed by students so that they can come back and finish their credentials. Even before the pandemic, we've covered a story about Wayne State University's Warrior Wayback, where when they eliminate student balances owed to the institution and welcome students back to the campus, not only are credential completion rates going up, but the institution itself is realizing an over 120% ROI on that investment. And so, do you think that this is a window of opportunity to just really kind of more holistically examine federal student loans and the way that we treat them aligned to our kind of talent goals?
So I think what's fascinating is that we're in the process right now of the negotiated rulemaking, right? So this is the public process where the department convenes a panel of stakeholders to seek to overhaul certain aspects of federal student loan policy, and we're knee deep in it. And what that means is that everything from the way you repay loans to income-based repayment, the way public service loan forgiveness works, that's the program for public servants after they pay a certain amount of their loans after several, I think 10 years. And so they can have the balance forgiven. That program has not worked to its optimal ability. And I think there's a lot of discussion about how to make it easier. So there we're at an interesting point where the Biden administration is trying to not only usher students back into repayment, but also really think about how can the system work better for the folks who may come into the system later on. A lot of conversation and public attention has been around the debt cancellation component, but there's still the underlying cause of all of this debt, right? A system that is not very affordable to many people, a system that is exceedingly complicated once you are in it, and there has to be ways to address that. I think we're at a point where we're starting to see the administration address it. Advocates aren't completely thrilled at some of the proposals that are coming out of this negotiated rulemaking bit. They had hoped for more, I guess, sweeping changes to some of these programs, and we're not quite there yet. But we still have so many more months before I think you'll see a lot of these reforms take shape completely. So there's still opportunity for folks to be thinking about how to align the goals of having a more educated, a more skilled workforce, and bring them up through post-secondary education in a way that is equitable for them, sustainable for them, as well as for our country. Debt financing, while it is an avenue that allows for a broader kind of inclusion of other communities into higher education, because not everyone can afford to pay full freight, naturally, it can be a burden that is really difficult to overcome, especially for low resource people. So I think we're seeing policy advocates as well as the administration think about that and really start to try to make it into their policy reform. But what that exactly looks like, it will be interesting to see over the course of the year where we land as opposed to where we start.
Have you been hearing, a substantial enough conversation about equity in conversations around, the negotiated rulemaking in these conversations? Certainly, I think to your point, there's a lot of advocates and advocacy organizations that are saying, listen, this doesn't go far enough, or this isn't what we really need, et cetera. And I guess I'm wondering from your reporting and looking at this, is the tenor of the country that, equity is being sufficiently addressed in these opportunities, or is there still room for us to do more now during the negotiated rulemaking process?
There certainly is room to do more during the process, but I got to say the conversations and the discussion about what an equitable system could look like or should look like are a lot more robust this time around than I've seen in previous kind of new rulemaking sessions, and just generally where where the department is, right? So thinking about their acknowledgement that student loan debt is being shouldered by a lot of Black and brown people who could least afford to repay it. They're thinking about how to address Parent Plus loans. Now, their advocates are saying they certainly are not going far enough to really address the burden that parent lending has placed on Black and brown communities. And there is still room for improvement. I think we're seeing that in the income-based repayment proposal, which the Biden administration wants to make more generous, but just for undergrads and for undergraduate debt, that is. And the exclusion of graduate debt and exclusion of Parent Plus debt is a great concern because this is where we're seeing the greatest growth in terms of the balances. And this is also where we're seeing a lot of pressure points in terms of the disparities in who's borrowing, how much they're borrowing, and whether or not they'll be able to pay it back at a reasonable amount of time.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the tricky things I have to imagine that you have to contend with too is that, it's not just, it's no longer enough, or maybe never was, to just track what's coming out of, the education department. There's a lot of federal agencies that are getting more and more active in talent development, and particularly on the workforce side that has clear connections to higher education, especially as higher education is finding new ways to package and recognize or align with short-term credentials. I got to imagine, I know that, the Commerce Department has a number of packages coming out, the VA has a number of packages coming out, as you look at, the kind of Build Back Better bill generally, what does that kind of portend for higher ed in particular?
What I think is really important about the Build Back Better bill, and just generally, as you mentioned, all of the agencies that have long been involved in aspects of higher education, but it wasn't necessarily called higher education, it was workforce development. And if we think about post secondary education, it has to be inclusive of everything from certificates to bachelor's degrees to master's degrees and such. It has to be a continuum. And what's nice about the Build Back Better bill is that you're seeing that continuum reflected in the provisions that are being proposed. And I think there's a fair amount of support within the majority of the Democratic Party to see that reflected in the kind of apprenticeship opportunities, the kind of grant programs that are afforded to folks who are just trying to upskill at this point. So that's a nice shift. That's a good shift because we also are at a point where we really need high school students to fully imagine what is possible for them and to continue to think about education as a continuum. Even if you were to start off with a high skilled job right now, that doesn't preclude you from being able to pursue a bachelor's degree at some point. I think that was the purpose of the community college program that didn't quite make it into the final legislation that's being debated. Well, hopefully will be debated at some
Mhm.
point in the Senate. But it does kind of shift the consciousness about what post-secondary education should be and could be. I think some of the most important provisions that I've seen coming out of Build Back Better is expanding federal student aid to undocumented students, to DACA students, and TTPS students, and TPS students. Sorry, guys. But uh, getting a broader understanding of where the vulnerable students are and how to meet them there and be more be be offer more outreach. I think the other part, and this is kind of to your point earlier of thinking about schools using the COVID relief money that they received in order to wipe away student balances, is that there's a provision within Build Back Better that would afford them to do that almost on a permanent basis, right? Through emergency grant programs, through all this sort of wraparound services that can help students from falling through the cracks as they're pursuing an education. So we're really starting to see a more full-throated approach to higher education that is inclusive of workforce development, that is inclusive of higher education in the more traditional sense. And I think that's an important shift that hopefully will continue in the coming future.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen much of the same thing. We've been working with a lot of, regions and folks that are interested in applying for the Good Jobs Challenge, for example, which is coming out of the EDA. And, the Good Jobs Challenge, of course, is focused on sectoral based partnerships and making sure that regions have the talent they need to meet the demands of today and tomorrow. But importantly, they've called out the critical role that wraparound services and wraparound service providers are playing, rather than just going straight to kind of the training programs. And I too am encouraged by that kind of more holistic and comprehensive approach. I guess one of the things I'm curious about is, are you hearing from folks concerns or issues about a lack of coordination? I mean, the reality is that with so much federal dollars coming in, there are a lot of folks on the ground that are trying to figure out how to access the, potential new dollars, grant programs that are coming out of various federal departments, in addition to those that are being channeled through their state. Are you hearing any concerns about the implementation between multiple agencies, either at the federal level or between the federal and state level?
Oh, of course. That's kind of perennial if you really think about it. I mean, look, the federal government can be good and Congress can be good at writing statutes. Actually implementing them is a very different thing. And trying to coordinate all of these services at the same time is exceedingly complicated at times. And I think we saw this in the three pots of pandemic relief funds, right? So you had this tremendous amount of money that was coming through a number of departments, and you had schools and for instance colleges waiting months for guidance. And then when they got it, it wasn't as comprehensive as it could be, so they weren't really sure. And no one wants to run afoul of the federal government and risk an audit or anything like that. So sometimes the bureaucracy slows things down. Oftentimes agencies aren't talking to each other, and the folks who are trying to be the recipients on the ground, again, don't want to run afoul of the government. So they're waiting, sometimes patiently, sometimes not as patiently, to receive some kind of guidance as to what to do. And I think we're going to see a fair amount of those growing pains if and when the Build Back Better legislation is passed, and trying to figure out how best to implement it in a way that doesn't create all these unnecessary consequences, as well as doesn't kind of stymie the potential of these programs by having a lot of bureaucracy that schools or any stakeholder that has to participate has to get like a team of lawyers to figure out before they're willing to dive in. So that's just naturally what's going to be the case. I imagine we're going to see a bit more of that because there are so many moving pieces, and there are so many agencies involved, and there are so many stakeholders involved, and it's a bit daunting for folks who are trying to get in on this process, who don't necessarily have an infrastructure in place in order to deal with all of kind of this bureaucratic level of administration. So yes, people are thinking about this. They are lightly complaining. I imagine that those complaints will grow as we see more of this kind of coordination between agencies need to come to bear in order for these programs to be successful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're 100% right. I think it's going to be an interesting thing for us to keep an eye on into the next year, and yeah, I suspect too there's going to be a lot of voices and perspectives that are informing that. I mean, I think the other thing too, kind of. We talked about how some of the protections that were added, during the peak of the pandemic, particularly around student loan, delaying the repayment or whatever the word is. I can't think of it at the moment, but I guess I'm curious to get your perspective too on what do you see as some of the potential other long-term impacts that COVID's still playing, particularly for vulnerable student populations.
I think the continued decline in enrollment at community college is something to watch, and at regional public colleges and university as well. If you are paying attention to where the vast majority of students are actually educated, then you have to pay attention to community colleges and the more regional schools, because that's where there are. And if you're seeing 5%, 10% declines in enrollment still, that's really concerning. I spoke to the head of Maryland's Community College Association, and he was reporting that a lot of his member schools are still seeing 10% declines. That's significant. That means that there are lots of vulnerable low-income folks who are still not quite back to the point where they can work and go to school, because that's often the case for a lot of folks in this population. They're having to make the decision to try to work, and if they're unable to do both, then we're talking about a lost a number of years lost to what could be creating a more skilled and trained workforce. So I think that's why there was so much hope for the community college promise program, I guess, in the Build Back Better legislation. But that doesn't mean that states aren't still looking at this, that community colleges aren't still trying to figure out how to get that population back. But it is fascinating that even as the economy rebounds, you're still going to see a fair amount of folks who are not going to be able to come back into higher education because they're having to make these trade-off choices.
Yeah. I mean, have you heard any promising ideas, solutions on that front, particularly around the community college enrollment? I mean, yeah, I guess I'll just leave it there.
I think, the community colleges that are really tapped into the business community and kind of working with them to either do some training programs may see some success in the coming year or so. These programs have produced successful results in the past where, say, an employer is having their employees do a little upskilling at the local community college that could increase enrollment. The dual enrollment programs are also very advantageous advantageous for community colleges, and I expect that it may continue to be as students want to try to save money on college costs by getting some credentials before they reach campus. But a lot of it is kind of a wait and see, right? So it's interesting. Before the pandemic, we were still in a cycle of enrollment decline for a couple of reasons. When the economy is doing well, people tend to forego college in order to go into the workforce. We also have some demographic challenges because you simply don't have the same robust number of high school age students coming into the system. And so while some schools were very keen on trying to attract an adult population with more flexible hours, flexible classes, and have we're seeing some successes, that same population is going to have the additional stress of having to take care of a family and make the choice to work and focus on that rather than school. So there will be a rebound at some point. It may take a while, and it may not be a complete rebound because the headwinds of the demographic changes and a strong economy always add pressure to higher education. And I don't think that's going to let up.
Yeah, I so appreciate that perspective because I think, you know, it's easy to point to affordability, which is of course a key issue. But beyond that, you know, what I keep hearing you say and reiterate is that it is also about how additional education beyond high school can fit into the daily lives of people, and that individuals have to wrestle with working full time, raising families, contributing to their family, all these other life elements. And so I know one of the things I'm going to be keeping an eye on and looking into 2022 for is to see those colleges and places that respond with some true structural changes in the way that education is delivered, when and where it happens, and what is and is not counted for education. Because I think that's going to be, I'm hopeful that this is an opportunity for colleges to really take a hard look at all of their practices and all their policies, to try to meet today's learners a little bit better.
I think what's really fascinating is that we are seeing schools trying to beef up their online programs for adult learners. And I think HBCUs have really kind of moved into that space in the last year or so. I think of Morehouse, and I think North Carolina A&T are as places that are rolling out these kind of online programs in order to help folks who have some credits but who never completed college to finish up their degree at a more affordable price. Now, of course, these sorts of partnerships can sometimes be tricky. There are a lot of consumer advocates who are always trying to pay attention to what sort of tuition are being charged to these populations of adult learners that are coming into the system. But there is potential there. There is potential there in the sense that you can still get a quality education at places that know how to serve students who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, but perhaps haven't always opened their arms to older students. And that has to be a part of the equation for higher education, period. You just simply don't have the numbers of traditional age students in order to ignore that population. They are there. There are so many people who have some college credits, but not a full degree, who are interested in college, but they want to know how that's going to fit into their lives as they're raising children, taking care of families and themselves. And so to see more schools be cognizant of that and start to implement plans to address that population is something worth watching over the next couple of years, especially if there are pitfalls in this. Like there will be some successes, but there will also be some kinds of consequences that are worth watching to make sure it's affordable, to make sure it's equitable, to make sure that these adult learners aren't being taken advantage of to subsidize undergraduate education, which we have seen in the past. So all those things are worth watching, but the way schools are embrace non-traditional, even though some folks will say they are becoming the traditional students, older students, will be interesting to pay attention to.
Yeah, agreed. Well, before I let you leave, what are you most optimistic about in 2022?
I am optimistic that a lot of colleges and universities have learned tremendous lessons about how to serve vulnerable students. I think we will see some of that pandemic response become baked into how they address the needs of their student population, because the reality is there are lots of talented students who simply do not have the resources in order to complete their education. And we are at a point where the national conversation around student debt forgiveness is forcing folks to really reckon with their role in the lending system. Are you saddling families with reasonable amounts of debt? Are you creating a situation where higher education becomes an albatross, right, for students? And you don't want that around the neck of students. And I think colleges certainly want to be a part of the solution more than they want to be a part of the problem. I think you're starting to see that with kind of the resurgence of these no loan policies, Ohio State and Smith College and such. They want to be in the forefront of trying to address some of these policy issues with taking a hard look at how they contribute to the problem. So I'm really interested to see whether there's a lot of more understanding, compassion coming out of this pandemic for how students are coping with not only the financial component but also the mental health component. One thing I am really heartened to see is more schools that are pouring resources into counseling and trying to encourage faculty and staff to be more compassionate towards their students who are going through a lot, and also hopefully being more compassionate to their faculty and staff.
That's right.
I'm hopeful that we will see kind of a culture shift in not just looking at students as consumers, right, but looking at them as a part of a community that needs support on so many levels, with or without a pandemic looming large over our heads.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I just want to say thank you so much for all of your reporting too. I have your, like your page on the Washington Post, like bookmarked. I check it often. Like you're someone who I make sure I read when you write. So folks, if you haven't checked out Danielle Douglas-Gabriel's really great work at the Washington Post, be sure to check it out. It's in our show notes. Danielle, thank you so much for joining me again for our yearly look back, look ahead, the game of will it happen, won't it happen? I love playing that with you, and I just really appreciate it, and looking forward to connecting in 2022 to keep an eye on these and many more stories.
Definitely. Thanks again for having me on. I really appreciate sharing all of these thoughts with you. Let's see if they turn into story ideas.
Yeah, that's right. Anytime. All right, well, have a great holiday. We'll see you. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. I'm now joined by my very good friend and co-host, Dr. Katherine Wheatle. Katherine, thanks for coming on today to wrap up 2021 and look ahead to 2022.
Well, it's always good to be on the show. Thanks, Dakota.
Yeah. It was fun because I know when you and I were chatting about this, we're obviously hearing from some of our national reporter colleagues like we did in segment one, but there are just a bunch of stories I think that us individually have been keeping track of over the past year. And so I thought it would be kind of a fun activity for me to come up with some 3 things that I've been kind of keeping an eye on, and for you to come up with your 3 things and chat through them today. Does that sound like a good plan to you?
It sounds like a plan. I have my 3, so I'm curious to see what yours are.
Yeah. I got to believe there's some overlap. And I'll just say too, it's one of these things where as I was digging into this, it's really hard. It was hard to like parse out what is good industry news versus what's like widely applicable. So I tried to find a good balance of like stories that are deep and interesting and weird versus those that are like in the national news attention. So let's see how we did.
Okay, let's go.
All right. So the first one that I've been kind of keeping track of and I think is deserving of an update is, of course, Operation Varsity Blues, the college admissions scandal. So, back in August 2020 on episode 23, we actually had 2 reporters from the Wall Street Journal, Melissa Korn and Jennifer Levitz, who also wrote a book called Unacceptable, and that they've been covering this story. And, you, our listeners, will remember, this got a lot of high profile attention because of some celebrities and a lot of financiers and CEOs of major corporations that essentially worked with an individual to game college admissions systems by getting people, promises on lacrosse teams and water polo teams and cheating on tests and all those kinds of things. And so just kind of some updates, I think, what happened over the past year, or at least since our last show about this in August 2020. First, I didn't know this, but there's actually a Netflix documentary out there now about this. That was released in March 2021. So I guess I just missed that. I guess maybe it was on a list and I forgot about it. But there was a total of 50.
Yeah, let me jump in on that. So I have not watched it because
Yeah.
I take issue with finding higher ed and entertainment. I know we had a pop ed segment the beginning of the podcast series, but it has been really tough to jump into series fact fiction in higher ed. But what's so interesting about the Netflix series is that it takes verbatim what folks have said in conversation as part of the evidence, and then bringing actors to it so that folks get into the scandal that it was, and to really be a parent who was bargaining for admission for their for their child.
Wow, how interesting. Yeah, I saw that it described it as like reenactments,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, ooh, I should maybe I'll take a look at that one of these days. You know, I don't know the next time. It seems like a good airplane thing for me personally. So maybe, I don't know the next time I'll be on a plane though. But so yeah, that was interesting. There's a total of 57 defendants that were charged. 47 of them, at least from what I found, have pled guilty as of, I think, a couple of weeks ago. There was the first trial though in Boston got completed, and they ended up finding two fathers that were charged guilty. And so they're pending sentencing right now, and the sentencing ranges can range up to like 20 years. But of course, people are thinking it's going to be much less than that. But most defendants have already pled guilty, like I said, and they have to pay fines. They're serving jail time, completing community service, which was interesting. So I think for the future, a couple of things. One is that, there's going to be some future cases that are going to court, some that haven't been pled out yet. So we're going to continue watching those come through the judicial system in 2022. But also, I think that there's been this, I've started, noticing some ancillary investigations and stories that kind of stem away from Varsity Blues. And in particular, not long ago, a former dean of Temple University's business school was convicted of conspiracy and wire fraud based on a scheme where he and some colleagues used false data to improve their college ranking for the U.S. News World Report. And there's a lot of people that are connecting the stories of saying, look at how our system is truly broken. On one end, on the consumer end, if you will, we have people, paying millions of dollars and breaking the law to try to get kids into institutions. And on the institution side, of course, this is only one bad actor, to be clear, but, there's clearly a culture of wanting to, increase your status in these ranking reports, which we know are deeply flawed, but that's a whole nother topic for another day, just to try to attract these learners. And on the second part of this is like, the reason I chose this one, even though it's like a biggest celebrity thing that I think we all just kind of keeping track of, but there's such a crazy juxtaposition here, Katherine, because we're also right now talking about how hard it is to get enrollment back to pre-pandemic levels, particularly at institutions that serve the majority of America. And so to me, it's just like, at the most meta 75,000 foot level observation I could even make around how do all these dots connect. It's like, very clearly, our higher ed access system is not working for anybody. There are people on the institutional side that are feeling like they might need to game and squeeze every ounce out of this, crazy ranking system we have. There is the wealthy elites trying to find ways to, in some cases cheat and lie and, whatever. And on the legal side, probably provide as much support and tutoring and coaching and college application ghostwriting that they possibly can. And then everyone else, we're still trying to figure out, how do we change these systems of enrollment to meet the people of today who need to get upskilled and reskilled and be able to participate in the workforce. And so it's an interesting constellation of stories to keep track of. And I think the Varsity Blues one is just, one kind of shining light of that constellation.
That's right. I love the way that you juxtapose the American interest in scandals like this, in admissions, in comparison to the institutional types that are really serving today's students. No one is, well, not necessarily hear a lot of scandals involving community colleges, but there's something about the zero-sum thinking that gets activated when we think about a highly competitive institution and their first-year student class and profile that I'm hoping that we can break away from, because the reality is that the majority of working age Americans are going to need some type of credential or be re-credentialed. And so what does that mean when we're constantly talking about elite institutions and the very wealthy and what they're willing to do for nepotism?
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll say on this too is like, it helps us start to delineate the difference between a capital S scandal, like Varsity
Mhm.
Blues and like these blatant violations of law, and lowercase s scandals, which like so many people experience on a daily basis when they try to transfer to an institution, but they can't access their prior transcripts. When they leave military service with tons of education and training, none of which counts for in the higher education system. When all these other barriers are thrown up for people who are just simply trying to get the education and training, or even access public benefits that they're eligible for to help them have a more prosperous life. And so I'm always encouraged to see how the big S scandals can help shine light on the lowercase s scandals that folks experience every day. But that's my first story, and we have so many more to get to. What's your first story that you've been tracking this year?
So I think the transition in thinking about what a crisis or a scandal is, I think is a huge theme for 2021. And so my first big theme of stories that came out this year are about student activism, whether it be students at Columbia engaging in unionizing or thinking about graduate assistance and strikes, or the undergraduates at Georgetown or at Howard who were concerned about housing and representation on their board of trustees. Students are back on residential campuses, whether in a hybrid or in-person model, and they're talking back to their administrators. They're talking back about housing. They're talking about racial equity and justice. They're talking about, we had in October, Jael Karandi, who talked about her experience on campus and talking and working with campus policing. So I think there's a thing here to consider for higher education as we're going into the next year is how our institutions, both colleges and universities and other stakeholders, going to respond to adults who are talking back and saying what their needs are. How does the system of higher education, how do individual institutions, and how can policy be more responsive to today's students, their needs, as we are going through the pandemic and thinking about what you shared, Dakota, about enrollments declining and spiking, and what does that look like across different institutional types in the sector. So I am admittedly outside of a campus, and so I can read and look at these stories very differently, I think, than those who are facing the additional pressure of students who are organizing. And it's been really interesting to see the different responses. It makes me think of past guests who have talked about institutional change for racial equity and justice and what it requires. And that, administrators, community members, students, faculty are all active stakeholders in what it means to show up at this moment as higher ed is transforming.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great one for us to kind of recap and keep an eye on. I mean, I'll just say, one, Katherine, I've appreciated, all your contributions to the show on this particular topic, right? Because I have learned quite a bit over the past year. And one of the things I'm taking away from this conversation too is the cyclical nature of demonstrations, protest, and generally kind of social advancement that happens on college campuses. This is not the first time our higher education system has had to contend with student activism and activism more generally. And yet I think that we are entering, if not we're in, it's always hard to know when you enter, when you're in, when you're heading out of a particular phase, but we're certainly around that phase, if not in it or entering, of another, I think, prolific period of activism on campuses. And I think the second thing is that, it really is, yes, about, student voice into how campuses and colleges operate into other areas that used to have been clearly the domain of faculty, staff, administration, but then also how many students and others are using a college as an epicenter for community level activism. And so it's putting the community back into the college, whether this is college or university, and kind of breaking down that, those walls between the town and gown relationship. So I agree. That's a great one for us to keep an eye on.
Thanks. So what's your next one, Dakota?
Yeah, it's hard to have a conversation that recaps this year or the prior year or any future years without, of course, talking about COVID. COVID and immunizations, I think and in particular, immunizations of vaccine is I kind of want to where I wanted to hone in on. I think as we were walking into 2021, there was a lot of speculation still about, what campus could look like, what in-person instruction is going to look like. I think a lot of folks had at the time anticipated many more disruptions, the potentiality of super spreader events, and even potentially, some more resistance to vaccination and testing protocols and social distancing. And, I even go back to our May 2020 episode, episode 22, where we interviewed, Chancellor Salgado from Chicago and, Chancellor Heller from Texas and others who did talk about the early kind of reshaping and what they need to do to meet students where they are to respond to the pandemic then. And so as we look back to 2021, it's a little bit less about the response and more about like living with the pandemic. So, for me, there are a lot of localized stories around issues of vaccine and vaccines and testing. But, I think overall the trend seems to be that like it kind of went okay for most places. The New York Times had a really great tracking tool for a while. They last updated it in May 26th. And they said that between January 1 and May 26th, that there was 260,000 cases linked to American colleges and universities. And don't get me wrong, that's a big number. It's a lot of people. But in relation to, I think, the potential, I personally was a little surprised it was honestly that low over that short amount of time. Beyond that, I'll say too that vaccine mandates and other protocols, I think, have largely been left in place. And I know this was really aided by Indiana University's vaccine mandate, not being touched or not being blocked. That case went all the way up to Justice Amy Coney Barrett for her review, and she rejected bringing it to the attention of the Supreme Court, leaving it in place for now. So I think what we need to watch for when it comes to vaccines and immunizations is, there is a potential uptick in cases. So Forbes just had a piece written by a former university president, Michael Neitzel, sorry if I mispronounced that last name, who is kind of calling attention to some of the increased cases as we approach winter. And then, of course, Omicron. And I know it's still early, but, it is something that I think, campuses are going to have to continue to contend with. I think the other bit is that, there is, of course, state and federal vaccine mandates coming out that may or may not impact colleges and universities that are going to have to figure out those territories, particularly those that are public institutions versus private institutions. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how, federal and state level vaccine mandates impact college campuses on their staff and faculty. And then finally is booster shots. And our good friend and colleague, reporter at NPR, Elissa Nadworny, just filed a story on December 3rd about booster shots that suggests colleges, are going to be making these choices individually, but also talks about the kind of receptivity that booster shots have already received. And we actually have real quick here a bit from Elissa to share with us. So let's see what Elissa's been reporting out her story.
We should first say that college campuses are some of the most vaccinated spaces in America. Colleges have done a really great job of getting their student bodies and their staff vaccinated. This is with and without mandates. So that's just a really important thing to note. More than 1,000 colleges have required vaccines. So a lot of colleges are thinking, okay, what does the booster shot mean for us? And especially those 1,000 plus institutions that have already made the vaccine a requirement are thinking, how do we deal with this? And in my reporting, I found kind of two approaches so far, and I imagine perhaps that will shift and change as things move on. But so far, it's been a few out in front, like Wesleyan, Smith, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, saying we're going to add that requirement. Students, staff, they're going to have to get the booster shot as well to be fully vaccinated on campus come spring. So these are decisions for spring. And then there are the campuses like Duke, Rutgers University, who are saying we're really encouraging folks to get the booster, but we're not going to make it a requirement yet. The vaccines are pretty readily available for college campuses. Like lots of campuses, regardless of requirements, are hosting vaccine clinics, are helping students figure out how to get appointments nearby campus. So they're making it really accessible, which I think was key certainly over the summer, in the spring, and in the fall for like getting campuses vaccinated. It was convenient. It was a social norm. Like colleges really did a good job. So they're perfectly positioned to kind of get folks on board with this third shot or second shot, the booster. I do think it's really worth noting some of the vaccination rates on campuses where there aren't requirements. And a lot of that is social norming. It's just become, this is what our community does to keep us safe. And I think that's really important to see. One of the stories I would love to get to in 2022 is just kind of showing that college campuses are kind of like, could be a model for a lot of communities, a lot of places in America to show what it looks like to live with COVID. The reality is probably we're not going to have 0 case campuses always. I mean, even these campuses that are 100% vaccinated, they wear their masks in class, they have a couple cases. It's what's happening. They're not getting really sick, they're not getting hospitalized, and they're able to keep the contagion to a minimum. So I'm even thinking of Wesleyan. When I talked to them about their booster requirement, they had noted that they had a bit of a spike, as they called it, before Thanksgiving. And when you look at the numbers, we're talking about just a handful of cases. So I think in a lot of ways, college campuses kind of show the rest of America what it could be like to live with COVID. And I think that's kind of an important lesson that I don't think we're quite internalizing yet.
Yeah, so I think there's still a lot to explore as we walk into the new year when it comes to COVID, vaccines, and immunizations in particular.
One of my stories was related to COVID, and it was more along the lines of last year we talked about what it's like to transition. And I think this year I've heard more folks talk about how difficult it is, even though there was some sort of a transition. So I think we've heard a lot of stories of families and students who had to find Wi-Fi, for example, in different places. So thinking about the many times I've heard the story of students getting Wi-Fi in McDonald's parking lots, or where public infrastructure and the lack thereof is actually connected to higher ed, and then that is also connected to student outcomes. Another story that is, I think, was COVID related that you heard a little bit about, but didn't, I think, make highlight or spotlights, are the many developing institutions, HBCUs and others, who utilize their their COVID fund dollars to support or relieve students with institutional debts. I think that might have been a bit of a controversial move, or seen as a controversial move among some, thinking that institutions are essentially relieving themselves of debt. But I see it as an opportunity for institutions to use this additional federal funds to support their students in completion, return, as well as thinking about institutional health and financial well-being. So those are the things that come up for me for COVID. I know folks have said that we are working and living through twin pandemics in this country, but the first one, racism, was here before the second one, the global health crisis. And, developing institutions have always had to punch above their weight or use resources to support students who we know by research has been the most neglected by the system. Just thinking about the ways that those administrators and those students have had to either continue or stop out, and what are decision points made for them. So there's still more to learn. I'm looking forward to more stories from folks on the ground and how these policy and social issues are actually impacting enrollment and completion.
Yeah, I think that's such a good thing for us to keep track on because, to your point, eventually we're going to be able to see the impact all the dollars that have flooded in the system during recovery might have. And even keeping track of GEARS funding and keeping track of all the other federal programs that we have going on right now. I mean, there's even talk about with the infrastructure bill about to what extent is talent and humans part of infrastructure. And that goes directly to the conversation you were just having about broadband and all those kinds of issues. So clearly there's some, I think, acknowledgement that, siloed funding systems may not be the best way forward because of how intertwined and complex a lot of these challenges are. But it will be really interesting, I think, over the next year or two. We're probably going to start seeing some evaluations and early data and assessments about how these dollars have been used in different ways and what the impact those dollars might have had, including what you're talking about within the debt forgiveness kind of realm as well. I think that'll be really interesting to keep track of.
That's right.
Yeah. Speaking of money, that's actually my third story. And this one to me is like, I don't know why. I find these kinds of stories really, really fascinating. And what I'm talking about here is the role that private money can play inside higher education. So very clearly, there is a lot of state and federal resources flooding into higher education, and that there's a lot of private philanthropic capital also flowing into higher ed, particularly around community colleges, the upskilling conversation, et cetera. But setting all of that aside for a moment, I've started to notice and kind of keep track of and follow a couple of stories about, individual high net worth folks that are starting to use their financial, influence in higher ed in some interesting ways. And I have kind of two stories for you, Katherine. You probably heard about this one. There's a strange story about what happens when you mix a 97-year-old billionaire who has a hobby as an architect and a higher ed institution with a pretty bad need of student housing. You get a crazy, crazy plan called the Munger Hall. And if you're not familiar with this, comes out of UC Santa Barbara, who has a student housing issue. They were interested in building a new student living facility, new dormitory. And 97-year-old billionaire Charles Munger offered to donate $200 million to the construction of a new dormitory on two conditions. One, it has to be named after him, which is like what that happens all the time. But second, and I think most strangely, is that he gets to be the designer and architect for it. And apparently this is not the first time he's done these kinds of projects, but this one caught a lot of attention. As one LA Times columnist put it, it's a design that will house over 4,500 students. That's right, 4,500 students in an 11-story warehouse-sized building where 94% of the living units do not have access to natural light or fresh air. And you got to see the photos of this thing. It is wild. I mean, this stuff is like straight out of Black Mirror, this dystopian kind of like, how do we pack as many people in as small of a place as possible? This got some really big national attention when a key member of UC Santa Barbara's design review team, someone who is a well-known professional architect in the area and who served this institution for over 15 years, very publicly resigned in protest. Since then, there has been a lot of other letters and concerns and people, raising their voice saying, listen, this is, inhumane. We should not be agreeing, and putting ourselves on the hook just to get this money. But so far, last I heard is that UC Santa Barbara still plans on proceeding with these plans and with this architectural plan. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating one to follow, and is just another kind of data point in how big money, big private money from an individual can really sway an institution and an institution's priorities and others. And I think the second story that I'm kind of been keeping track of relates to this, and actually goes back to your first theme around student activism and activism more generally. There seems to be a rise of individual donors. Some reporters are saying, of the boomer generation, that are starting to withhold donations from colleges to push it back against what they believe is indoctrination on campus. And some of them are making the argument that campuses are not open enough to free speech, because they just feel like their ideas are not being well presented or are no longer, as one reporter put it, politically correct. And so these donors are trying to use their financial influence to kind of shape the way that campuses are operating when it comes to issues of ideas, as well as down into the weeds about what faculty do and do not do in their own classrooms. Douglas Belkin of the Wall Street Journal recently wrote a piece that featured a conversation between a donor and Cornell University, where the donor was going to withhold donations. They connected that donor to some faculty who they thought were like-minded, and it turns out the faculty said, listen, we have similar concerns. And that kind of blew up in Cornell's face. And so Cornell's still trying to wrestle, I think, with that, but they're not the only institution that is having this challenge of leveraging the relationships with high-level donors who clearly want to see have a little bit more influence on what happens inside the classroom. So I think we're going to, as we continue to follow, free speech on campus, as we continue to follow issues of student activism and activism on campus, there's also this other story that's related around the response to individuals who are no longer on that campus, but part of the campus community through their relationship as a donor, and to see, how they intend to use their influence to either support or quell free speech and demonstrations and other things that might happen on campus.
So, Dakota, some of the things that you mentioned align really well with my last news story for the year. And it's the rise of anti-CRT laws across the country, and that having clear implications for what it means to have academic freedom and freedom of speech at a university, what it means for the faculty to develop curriculum that is aligned with or connects with general education about sociology and ethnic studies and race and gender. I think about the many faculty who do teach critical theory or critical race theory specifically. And what does it mean for their work, their safety? What does it mean for the safety of researchers and legal scholars who engage in clinics? What does it mean for a state policy to put forward a law that essentially bans a theory? What are we talking about in 21st century? So I think as other policies and laws and conversations that impact the curriculum, that impact freedom of speech, they're going to be something to continue to watch and look at over the next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Katherine, it's hard, like we were saying earlier, it's hard to know when you're in a moment versus when you're, it's hard to know your place in history,
That's
and,
right.
I think one of the things I'm walking away with is, it's hard to know whether or not we are, in a period where the historic protections, the historic academic freedom, all those kind of protections that, while some have thrown, have some rightfully have called attention to as potential barriers to certain things, on the other hand, have the positive impact of giving people and scholars and researchers and others an opportunity to, advance, society by thinking and exploring things. And so a wide variety of topics. And so I think, the anti-critical race theory kind of stuff, the use of, high profile, high net worth individual donors to potentially sway, decisions that are being made on campus, and even what we're seeing in terms of, faculty tenure decisions and, and how ways that tenure can and cannot be negated, depending on the allegations that are being, there's been a number of cases, where faculty had to go about that. It's hard to know whether or not we're in a moment where there's an actual shift happening, or whether this is the kind of a flash in a pan and, part of where we're at in terms of kind of a political divide in the country. It's kind of hard at least for me to sit and figure out which one we're at.
That's right. And as you're tying them together, it makes me think of not necessarily a story, but a nexus of control is boards of regents and boards of trustees. So you think about the UNC story earlier this year with Nicole Hannah-Jones and her tenure case. And the overall critique of the liberalism of the college campus is coming from these political divides, these politically driven debates and conversations. And so I think higher ed in of itself has to think about what are the narratives versus what is actually happening. And what's actually happening is that there are students who are organizing and protesting. There are boards of trustees denying or engaging politically in tenure. There are state policies on the books or to come on the books about voting rights and freedom of speech. And so higher ed has to ask itself, what part does it want to play in the protections of little d democracy? We have yet to see, but these are big days for higher ed. Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, and I think the other thing the other thing that underpins this all is, who is being served by our institutions. And I think that's the other, while like you really importantly point out, to keep track of the narrative versus what's actually happening, it feels too that the floor might be moving on higher ed, the ground beneath their feet, because while, we and others have been long saying, listen, the students that your policies and systems and practices are designed to serve are no longer meeting the needs of today's students. I think that the quick realization has come to many campuses with the downturn in enrollment and seeing that the traditional methods of getting people back to campus might not be working as effectively as they did during other economic downturns. Okay. And so very clearly, there are, I think, are campuses that are trying to, address higher ed overall, I guess, is trying to address these larger issues around, small d democracy, around faculty, around tenure, around all these pieces, while at the same time truly figuring out who it is that they're intending to serve, which of course changes the way that they historically have operated. So it almost feels like everything's on the table right now, which is exciting, scary, all the things, I think, depending on who you are and where you sit in the conversation.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you're on the case helping me think through this. Certainly, there's a lot for us to track as we walk into the new year. I guess, Katherine, what's something that you're super hopeful will happen in 2022?
Oh, geez. I was just sitting here thinking we were just doing this and we were talking about 2021. I think I am still hopeful for signs of life. So I think all of the topics and issues that we've talked about, there are either examples or tick points that says that students, faculty, other stakeholders are interested in making the connections between higher ed and the rest of society in the same ways that folks did it in the 60s and 70s, as we have come to learn of the modern civil rights era. So I'm hopeful that people are no longer apathetic, no matter where you land on issues. And I know that journalists and others will have their time cut out as we go into 2022 to cover a lot of these issues as we continue through another year, another variant of the coronavirus.
Yeah. I think for me, I am hopeful about the not squandering the opportunity that all of this change has provided. I mean, obviously the pandemic's still going on. There's a lot of money flowing into the system. There's general acceptance that, we have to start figuring out better ways to serve today's students. And so I know that, for every campus out there, for every college leader out there who might be hesitant to, chart a path boldly into the future, there's another one, another campus, another higher leader who is boldly heading in that direction, finding new ways of working together, finding new ways to partner with those around them in their community to, really dramatically, make a positive impact. And so I think, while it is a time of struggle, I think for a lot of places in higher ed in a lot of directions, it's also an opportunity space. It's a big opportunity space for those that are ready to meet that challenge and redesign the ways that they operate to, produce better outcomes for folks and make sure people have the education and training they need to be prosperous. So I get really excited and am excited to continue following those places that are exemplars and innovators who have taken on the challenge of doing something innovative and productive with it. Well, Katherine, it's always a pleasure to recap the year and forecast ahead. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for a bit today.
Well, thank you for having me. I always enjoy our time together. And of course, listeners, talk back to us. What were the top 3 news stories for you? What do you think of our takes?
Absolutely. Looking forward to getting those for folks, and maybe you and I can revisit that on a future show. Well, 2021 was certainly a packed year. There's a lot of news and information to keep track of, and we know your time's valuable. I'm deeply grateful that you take part of your day to be with us, listening and watching the stories we bring you as we continue our effort to share unique perspectives in the field of learning after high school. Last year, we tackled the topics of innovation, racial equity in student loans, short-term credentials, supporting parenting students, policing on campus, and representation in journalism. We talked with scholars, senators, journalists, students, activists, and organizers, and we plan to do the same in 2022, bringing you voices and insights from the field that have something unique to contribute to the national conversation about talent. The only voice that's missing is yours. We want to know what you're interested in, what you want to hear, or if you have something to share on our show. Please do take a moment to email us at luminafoundation.org and share your thoughts and ideas. One more final note before we go. Over the holiday break, our friend, colleague, and co-host Dr. Katherine Wheatle has taken on a new role with the Packard Foundation. It has been a pleasure to have Katherine as a regular contributor to this show since we began, and as my co-host throughout 2021. All of us at Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent wish Katherine well in her new role, and we will certainly miss her voice and perspective. Well, that's all the time we have for today. My thanks to our guests, Danielle Douglas-Gabriel and Elissa Nadworny. And one last time, thanks to my co-host, Dr. Katherine Wheatle. Our show is produced by Jacob Mann, John Strauss, Katherine Wheatle, and me, Dakota Palicki, with support from Mark Allen, Matthew Jenkins, Amy Bartner, and the team at Site Strategics. Well Done Marketing supports the promotion of our show, and Deborah Humphreys and Kevin Corcoran provide leadership for Lumina's strategic engagement efforts. Please be sure to subscribe and rate our show wherever you're getting your podcasts. If you're listening on YouTube or on Apple, make sure you review us and click subscribe. If you have a comment or an idea for an episode, reach us at luminafoundation.org or reach me on Twitter at Dakota Palicki. Thank you for being with us, and we will see you next time.